welcome. For a number of weeks, we have really have had a continuous conversation about reaching, connecting with the world that is outside of our church world. And so I'm just going to kind of continue that part of the conversation today, start off and talk a little bit about one of the big hurdles, one of the huge barriers that most churches are facing as they try to reach out to just the community is the wide variety of cultures that we now find ourselves in. Some years ago, the culture that was in the community and the culture that was in the church was very similar. Those were during those years in which church attendance was high, in which the calendar of the church and the calendar of the community were often coordinated, and they kind of respected each other. And as long as there was one larger culture and the church lived within that culture, the church could grow effectively. It could do a lot of programs effectively. It could host a lot of events effectively. Just because of this very one thing, that there was a cultural kinship among people in the church and the community. As years went on, the church culture maintained the culture that it has, while the cultures outside of the church were beginning to change. As the cultures outside of the church began to change, the culture that was in the church, or the church culture, began to be seen as less relevant to the culture that was outside. And when I use a word like culture, I'm just simply talking about the basic perspectives in which people see life, the particular habits that might describe a certain people, or the beliefs, or the orientations, or the practices, or the traditions. In churches, this often comes up with the music issue. When I grew up, like many of you, in a church, there wasn't like you had to choose between this style of music and another style of music. It was what it was. It was culturally accepted, and the music that was in the church connected with the kind of music that people in the community were listening to. And then as the music scene shifted and all kinds of different things were shifting, the church was put in quite a conundrum. And that is, do we shift our cultural practice? Now, please don't hear me say, do we shift our theology? We're not talking about shifting our theology. We're not talking about shifting the gospel. We're not talking about shifting our convictions. We're not talking about shifting our beliefs. We're not talking about shifting our stand on the Bible. Not talking about those things. We're just talking about the various ways that people kind of order their lives. And I'm just simply suggesting that music is one of those big areas that really helps us to identify and to understand how cultures can be so different. And so as there was a growth of various cultures in our communities, the church began to realize that the church culture, which served it so well in years past because it was so similar to the culture that already existed outside of the church, that as the gap between church culture and culture outside of the church began to increase, the church began to be less relevant to those outside of the church. And so those inside of the church had to make fairly significant decisions. Do we keep holding on to our particular church culture, the way we think about church, the way we program church, the way we organize church, the way we do church? Do we still do that even though the culture outside of the church has moved in such a drastically different direction? Or do we do a much more difficult thing, and that is, do we put our church culture on the table and allow it to be massaged, allow the Spirit to kind of blow through it, to allow for there to be adjustment in the culture itself, so that we can minimize the culture of the church and the gap that exists between the culture of the church and the culture that is not in the church. I know that sounds like, well, we're giving up things that we believe in. And that's, and please hear again, that is not what this means. It just simply means that we are tuned in to the culture that is not in the church, that we can hear, that we can discern, that we can identify the culture that is not in the church, not so that we can create barriers to keep people of various cultural modes outside of the church, but so that we can present and live the gospel in such a way that the culture outside of the church can actually hear the gospel. And this is very stressful for churches. As churches, we have our own culture. It has been around for a very, very long time. And to have a conversation about changing the church culture, it oftentimes is a very threatening conversation. And it is a conversation that many people in church simply don't want to have. And so our typical response is just keep protecting and managing the culture that we have had for a long time. And the hope, deep within somewhere, is that if we just maintain and keep our eyes on the culture that we have had, then someday, everybody who's not part of that, everybody who has a different culture or who is outside of our church culture will just, God will move and people will wake up and then they'll come and join our church and our church culture. So if we believe that at the heart of the gospel is a God who can enter into any culture, and we've talked about before, that's what the incarnation is about. God enters in Jesus. Our culture, he enters first century Jewish culture. That if we believe that God can penetrate any culture, then imagine what would happen if any church believes the same thing. That God can work and penetrate in any culture. Most of us, I'm sure, would say, yeah, we believe that. The real question is, do we believe it so much that we would allow our own church culture to be shifted, to be rearranged, to be reordered to be redesigned, to be reimagined, so that we could be a church culture, part of a church culture in which those who are not part of the church can actually hear what we are saying when we proclaim or teach the gospel, or they can actually see what it looks like as Jesus is living out in us, because we have dismantled the cultural barriers that make it nearly impossible for people to hear across cultures, or to see across cultures, or to talk across cultures, or to fellowship across cultures. So this cultural idea is one of the biggest ones that we have to face. It's also one of the biggest ones that the Bible had to face. And it's always encouraging to go back and see how this discussion played out, for example, in the life of Jesus in the book of Acts. One of the things that was so compelling about Jesus was that people who may not have been part of the culture that he was in felt as if he was accessible, or he could hear them. The Samaritan woman, he heard her, but he was not a Samaritan. But there was a connection there that allowed him to understand and enter into that culture, and in response, she was able to hear the gospel. That happens time and again. It happens even certainly after Pentecost and the coming of the Holy Spirit. One of the big cultural issues of the day is, can Gentiles become Christians, or is the story of God's redemptive mission confined only to the Jews? Well, the Jews have their own culture, and they could certainly see that God had sent the Spirit. And when the Spirit began moving beyond their culture and in another culture that was very different from their own, they had legitimate questions about that. And one of the primary reasons that God called Paul to be the kind of apostle that he was because Paul could navigate cultures. Although Paul was a Jew, and he could speak in a Jewish setting, and he could speak in a synagogue, he allowed himself to be culturally shaped in such a way that he could enter into the Greek culture. He could, in other words, he could hear their music. He could hear their heart language. He could understand their poetry and their traditions. He was willing to give himself to a different culture for the purpose of presenting the message of the gospel of Christ, which is transcultural, can be delivered in any culture. But the key is that those who are sharing the message of Christ, we'll call it let's call ourselves for the moment the church or the Jesus culture, must be able to work and must be able to live in the host culture. This is the same kind of strategy that is applied to missionaries. In the missionary movement, there was one stream of thinking that said, we're going to send missionaries from our churches. So let's say we send missionaries from the U.S., or maybe even particularly missionaries from Baptist churches. And we send them to another country, and one mode of thinking was we will take our Western culture, Christianity, and try to plant it in another country halfway around the world. And so, as some missionaries were trying to go to other places and plant the Western church in a culture that was non-Western, it became very apparent that that was a very, very challenging move to make. So, missionaries had to rethink, and actually they had to go back and let, again, Jesus and Paul be the model. And rather than trying to export Western Christianity, they went to other countries and they became a part of the culture. They learned the language, they learned the music, they learned the traditions, they observed the habits and the styles of the people that they were seeking to reach with the gospel. And when that happened, there was an incredibly different story. When we become part of a host culture, then that host culture can hear the message and they can see Christ far more clearly than they can when we set ourselves up in the host culture, but we maintain our church culture. So if all of that makes sense to some degree, the mandate of the Great Commission and the life of Christ and the missionary movement of Paul, all of them are very much tied into cultural considerations. So let's just bring it all home. Here we are as a church family, and like all church families, we have an Ivy culture. We have a culture that is unique to us. We have a culture that has the touch of generations, and people have been before us, and we embrace that, and we celebrate that. And, we realize that we would not be here without the labor and the love of those who have gone before us. Many of those who were before us just so happened, it's nobody's fault, not ours, theirs, or anybody's, just so happened to live in a world in which the culture of society or the culture outside of the church, quite honestly, overlay much of the culture of the church, and people navigated in and out of church far more easily than they do today. So years ago, the conversation about, or this particular conversation about culture was not as relevant as it is now. One of the things that will certainly be challenging to every church and to our own Ivy family is this: how do we build bridges to the variety of cultures that are just outside our doors? How do we hear the message of the culture? Most people in church culture think we need to get the message of the gospel out to them, which is certainly true. But just like those of us who are in church culture cannot fully understand or hear the message of culture that is outside of church, the reverse is the same. And rather than creating church culture and trying to get people somehow think of the silver bullet, of course, of which there is none, the silver bullet of getting people to be part of not just our church, but it's really our church culture, the real question needs to be turned. And what we need to be talking about, and I think this is going to be challenging conversation, but I think it's going to be great conversation. These are the kind of conversations I love, and some of you are going to be right at home in this conversation. How do we hear the culture that we live, that we live among, that is different from the culture that we live in? So What would it take for Ivy to hear what is the culture of our immediate area of the peninsula? How do we better understand what makes culture that is non-church culture, what makes it tick, what makes it function, what are the values, what are the ways in which culture outside of church, how do they hear things? How do they receive things? How do they process things? And it could be that the most difficult and challenging thing that any church will ever do is learn the culture of the people who are not in church. We have learned the church culture. We get our culture. We know how it functions. We know how it operates. But we are challenged and we are compelled to listen to the culture of those who are not part of the church culture. And when we start making those efforts and when we start figuring out how do we invest ourselves in doing that, the culture that we are seeking to learn, it's just like learning a new language. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Learning a new culture so that we can understand it, so that we can embrace what is good and beautiful about it, and so that we can have a common language, a common way to share life in Christ. That's a heavy investment. So we live in times in which churches will choose one or two paths at the crossroads. Churches will either choose to hold on to the culture that got them there, the culture that they remember when things were in their best days, and they will just try to grip that culture more tightly and try to make that the culture that all of the non-church people will somehow magically become interested in. Or churches will begin to ask themselves, how do we make bridges? How do we develop relationships? How do we open our hearts, and how do we open our minds? How do we open our ears? How do we open our eyes to the culture that is around us? And how do we, just like Jesus entered our culture, what would it take for us to navigate ourselves as a church family into the culture, the huge cultural ocean that is around us? And once we are able to do that and think that way and invest our energy and our efforts in that way, then the gospel will be heard among people who will not hear it by coming to a church or by ever thinking one Sunday morning when they wake up, I should go to church. So this is a critical moment. This is a huge moment, but this is a gospel moment. And I just invite you to, be praying about this, to be thinking about it, to be reflecting on this. And I know we've talked about a lot of great topics that we can put on the table for conversation when we're able to do so and when we're together. And this is certainly going to be one of the biggest of those topics. So I hope that you'll just start giving yourself to that and thinking about ways that we as a people of Jesus in a particular church culture can begin to make ourselves available to the culture that is not our native culture, that is not our culture of intuition, that is not even our church culture. But how do we present ourselves? How do we relate ourselves in the context of that culture for the purposes of living and sharing the news that God has sent Christ to die for us, and that is for all people. And we can begin to worship together, to fellowship together, to live life together, and watch God do His work among so many various and different cultures. So God bless you as you put some effort and energy, research. Some of you would be really helpful to just, research the peninsula. That would be helpful to us. Just start identifying cultures and people groups. And as you can share that back with us, lead us and help us to broaden our hearts and our minds as we begin to move forward. So I look forward to this conversation and to this great challenge